The air in the penthouse was always the same, cold and thin, smelling of lemon-scented cleaner and something else, something sterile and metallic like a doctor's office. It was a smell that clung to your clothes and hair, a constant reminder of the gilded cage you were in. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled out like a glittering carpet of diamonds. But up here, on the 40th floor, there was no sound from the streets below. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft, rhythmic beeping of medical machines and the occasional, sharp sigh from the man in the bed, the woman, whose name was Clara, moved with a quiet efficiency that had been honed by years of hard work. Her worn-out sneakers made no sound on the polished marble floor. She was adjusting the drip on the IV stand, her fingers gentle and sure. The needle was taped to the back of a wrinkled, liver-spotted hand, a hand that once could crush business deals with a single handshake but now lay limp and helpless. She didn't look at the man's face. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend she was just tending to a machine, not a person. A person who took every opportunity to remind her that she was nothing more than a paid servant. Easily replaceable? Are you done yet? A voice rasped from the bed. It was a voice that had once boomed with power and authority, but now it was thin and reedy, stripped of its strength but none of its cruelty. Or do you plan on standing there admiring your own shadow all day? Clara flinched, just a tiny jump of her shoulders that she hoped he didn't notice. "Almost done, sir," she murmured, her voice soft and deferential. "Just need to check the flow rate." She kept her eyes downcast, focused on the clear liquid dripping slowly into his veins. It was her defense mechanism, a shield she had built around herself. Be invisible. Be quiet. Do your job. Go home. She repeated the mantra in her head, a prayer for the end of her shift. She thought about the stack of bills on her kitchen table, the worried face of her mother, the hopeful eyes of her younger brother, who dreamed of college. This job was a lifeline, no matter how much it felt like drowning. The man in the bed, Alistair Finch, watched her with eyes that were surprisingly sharp for a man his age, eyes that missed nothing. They were pale blue, like chips of ice, and they held a permanent glint of dissatisfaction. He saw the slight tremor in her hands as she worked, the way her shoulders were hunched with a weariness that went deeper than just a long day. He saw it all, and he took a small, private pleasure in it. It made him feel powerful, and power was the only thing he had left. "You're slow today," he snapped. "Slower than usual. Did you walk here? Or did you crawl from whatever hole you live in?" Clara bit the inside of her cheek, the coppery taste of blood a small, sharp distraction. She didn't answer. What could she say? Arguing was pointless. It only fueled his fire. Apologizing was worse. It was like throwing gasoline on a flame. So she remained silent, finishing her task with a precision that bordered on robotic. She smoothed the crisp, white sheets around his thin frame. Her movements practiced and devoid of any warmth. When she was done, she stepped back, ready to retreat to the safety of the kitchen to prepare his bland, tasteless lunch. But today, something was different. Today his eyes weren't on her. They had drifted past her towards the far corner of the massive, sparsely furnished living room. Her own eyes followed his gaze. There it stood. A grand piano, black and gleaming under the dim lights. It was a beautiful instrument, elegant and imposing, but it looked utterly out of place. It was like a wild bird trapped in a cage of steel and glass. A fine layer of dust coated its polished surface, and the keyboard was closed. Like a book with a story no one was allowed to read anymore. Clara had been working here for 6 months, and she had never seen it played. It was just another piece of expensive, unused furniture in a museum of a life. A slow, cruel smile spread across Alistair's thin lips. It was a look Clara had learned to dread. It was the look he got right before he said something truly awful, something designed to cut deep, to remind her of her place. His eyes flicked back to her, and the coldness in them was now mixed with a new, malicious curiosity. "You," he said, his voice suddenly clearer, stronger. He pointed a bony finger at her. "You look like you lead a very boring, very empty life. I bet you don't have a single interesting thought in that head of yours." Clara stood frozen, her hands clasped in front of her. She knew better than to move, to even breathe too loudly. His gaze shifted back to the piano. "I'll bet you can't even play that thing," he said, a sneer in his voice. "Can you? Can you even read music?" She didn't answer. Her heart was starting to beat a little faster, a nervous drumbeat against her ribs. She just wanted to leave. She wanted to be anywhere but here, in this room, under his piercing gaze. He seemed to enjoy her silence, her fear. It was a confirmation of his power over her. He leaned his head back against the pillows, a thoughtful yet menacing expression on his face. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "my wife, she used to play. All the time." This room was filled with music once. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of a memory, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar hardness. He looked directly at her again, and his voice dropped to a low, commanding tone. "I want you to play for me." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Play? For him? The idea was absurd. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Not since... She pushed the thought away. "Sir, I don't think that's a good idea. I have my duties." She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Your duties are what I say they are," he barked, his voice regaining its cruel edge. "And I'm telling you to play, now." He watched her, a predator savoring the fear of its prey. He could see the panic in her eyes, the way she was wringing her hands. He was enjoying this. This was better than watching television. This was real. Then his eyes narrowed, as if a specific, painful thought had just occurred to him. A new, more targeted form of cruelty. "I have a specific request," he said, his voice now a soft, dangerous hiss. "Don't just play any nonsense. I want a real song. I want you to play Clair de Lune." The name of the song hit her like a physical blow. It was as if he had reached across the room and slapped her. The air left her lungs, and a cold dread washed over her, so intense it made her feel dizzy. The world seemed to tilt, the sounds of the machines fading into a distant hum. Clair de Lune, the name echoed in her head, a ghost from a life she had tried so hard to forget. Her face went pale, all the color draining away. Her hands, which had been nervously clasped, began to tremble uncontrollably. Not a small shiver, but a violent, visible shaking that she couldn't stop. She tried to hide them, tucking them behind her back, but it was too late. He saw it. For the first time since she had started working for him, Alistair Finch saw a reaction in her that wasn't just quiet submission or tired resignation. It was something raw, something real. It was pure, unadulterated fear. And in his cold, empty heart, he felt a spark of satisfaction. He had found her weakness. He had found a way to break her. He leaned back against his pillows, a triumphant look on his face, and waited for her to obey. The words echoed in the sterile hallway, chasing her like a ghost. Clair de Lune. She stumbled away from the door, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her back hit the cool, unyielding wall of the corridor, and she slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The world felt like it was spinning, the polished marble floor blurring into a swirl of gray and white. She couldn't breathe. Each gasp for air was shallow and painful, like breathing through a straw. Her hands were still shaking, trembling so violently that she had to clasp them together to make them stop. It was a ridiculous, impossible demand. It wasn't just a song. It was a key. A key that unlocked a door she had bolted shut 20 years ago. A door behind which a different version of herself was trapped. A girl with bright eyes and a future filled with music. As she sat there on the cold floor, the sterile scent of the penthouse began to fade, replaced by something else. The smell of old books, of lavender sachets tucked into drawers, and the faint, sweet scent of roses from a garden just outside a sun-drenched window. The walls around her seemed to melt away, the cold marble replaced by the warm, worn wood of a much older, much cozier room. She was no longer a tired nurse in her late 30s. She was 19 again, her hands not calloused from years of work but smooth and strong. Her fingers long and nimble, made for the piano keys. In this memory. She was sitting at that very same grand piano, but it wasn't a dusty monument. It was alive, its black surface gleaming, every inch of it cared for and loved. Sunlight streamed through a large bay window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fairies. And in a plush armchair beside the piano, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, was Eleanor, Alistair's first wife. But in Clara's memory, she wasn't just Alistair's wife. She was Eleanor. Her Eleanor was frail, her skin as thin and delicate as parchment paper, but her eyes held a warmth that could fill the entire room. She was smiling at Clara, a gentle, encouraging smile that made Clara feel like she was the most talented person in the world. "Again," Eleanor would whisper, her voice soft as a breeze. "Play it for me again, my dear. You play it so beautifully." And Clara would play. Her fingers would dance across the ivory keys, coaxing out the haunting, beautiful melody of Clair de Lune. It was their song. Eleanor had told her once that it reminded her of moonlight on a still lake, a moment of perfect peace in a chaotic world. For Clara, it had become the soundtrack to her dreams. Eleanor had discovered her talent by chance. Clara had been a living companion, hired to help with the cooking and cleaning, but one afternoon when she thought no one was home, she couldn't resist the pull of the beautiful piano. Eleanor had heard her, and instead of scolding her for touching the expensive instrument, she had sat and listened for an hour. From that day on, everything changed. The cooking and cleaning were still there, but they became secondary. Eleanor became her teacher, her mentor, her friend. She hired a real tutor for Clara, paying for lessons out of her own personal allowance. She would sit with Clara for hours, listening to her practice, her eyes closed, a look of pure bliss on her face. "You have a gift, Clara," she would tell her over and over again. "A gift that was meant to be shared. You must never let anyone take that away from you." Clara remembered the day Eleanor gave her a leather-bound book of sheet music. It was expensive, a beautiful edition with gold-leaf pages. Inside, on the title page, Eleanor had written in her elegant, looping script, "To my Clara, may your music always light up the darkness. With all my love, Eleanor." Clara had cherished that book more than anything she had ever owned. It was a symbol of hope, a promise that her life of struggle and poverty was behind her, that a future as a musician was possible. Even Alistair was different back then. He was always busy, a whirlwind of phone calls and meetings, often gone for days at a time. But when he was home, he wasn't cruel. He was just distant. Sometimes he would stand in the doorway of the music room, watching them. His expression was hard to read, but there was no malice in it. He would watch his wife's face alight with joy as she listened to Clara play, and a flicker of something soft would pass through his eyes. He never said much, just a quiet, "good" or "sounds nice" as he passed by, but it was enough. In that house, filled with music and Eleanor's kindness, Clara felt safe. She felt like she was finally home, but the memory, like all good things, began to darken. She remembered the day the doctor came, the hushed, serious voices in the hallway, the way Eleanor's smiles became weaker, her frame more frail. The music didn't stop, though. If anything, it became more important. It was their escape, their sanctuary. When the pain was bad, Eleanor would ask Clara to play. "The Moonlight Song," she would murmur, her eyes closed. "Play the Moonlight Song for me." And Clara would play, her fingers trembling now not with excitement but with fear, pouring all her love and all her desperate hope into the music, willing it to make her friend better, but music couldn't cure what was wrong with Eleanor. The memory of the last day was a sharp, painful stab in Clara's heart. The room was quiet. The piano was silent. The scent of lavender was gone, replaced by the sharp, antiseptic smell of medicine. Clara held Eleanor's hand, which was cold and limp, and watched the rise and fall of her chest until it stopped. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard after the funeral. The house felt empty and cold. The sun still streamed through the window, but it couldn't warm the rooms. The piano stood with its lid closed, a black, mournful shape in the corner. Alistair was a ghost haunting the halls, his face a hard mask of grief. He barely looked at Clara. When he did, his eyes were cold, filled with a bitterness so deep it frightened her. She was a living reminder of the wife he had lost, of the music that no longer filled his home. A week after the funeral, he called her into his study. He didn't sit down, just stood by the window, looking out at the city. "Your services are no longer required," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He didn't turn around. "You will be paid for the month." That was it. No mention of Eleanor, no acknowledgement of the years she had spent caring for his wife, no offer to help her continue her music lessons. She was just an employee to be dismissed. Clara had packed her small bag, which contained all her worldly possessions. She hesitated, looking at the leather-bound songbook on her nightstand. But she couldn't take it. It felt like stealing, like taking a piece of Eleanor that didn't belong to her. She left it there, and with it she left her dreams. The memory shattered, and she was back in the cold, sterile hallway of the penthouse. A tear slid down her cheek, hot and salty. She wasn't just trembling with fear anymore. She was trembling with grief. Grief for the kind woman who had believed in her. Grief for the talented young girl she used to be. And anger. A deep, simmering anger at the man in the other room. The man who had taken everything from her then, and was now trying to tear open the wounds he had created. He didn't just want her to play a song. He wanted her to resurrect a ghost. And she wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive it. She pushed herself up from the floor, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. The cold from the marble had seeped into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She took a deep, shaky breath, forcing the air into her lungs, and straightened her uniform. She had to go back in. She had to face him. But first, she needed a moment. She walked to the small, sterile kitchen and splashed cold water on her face. The shock of it brought her back to the present, back to the reality of her situation. The ghost of Eleanor and the girl she used to be would have to wait. Right now, she was just a nurse who had a job to do, a job she couldn't afford to lose. For the next 2 days, a tense and fragile truce settled over the penthouse. The man didn't mention the piano again. He didn't mention the song. But the unspoken demand hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating like smoke. Clara moved through her duties with a quiet desperation, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She was extra careful with his medication, meticulous with his meals, and silent during his checkups. She hoped, with a desperate, foolish hope, that he had forgotten. That his cruel whim had passed, but he hadn't forgotten. He was just waiting, savoring the anticipation. He could see the change in her. The fear was still there, a constant tremor just beneath the surface of her professional calm, but now it was mixed with something else. A deep, lingering sadness that intrigued him. He found himself watching her more closely, trying to piece together the puzzle. Why would a simple song terrify her so much? It was a mystery, and he was a man who had always enjoyed solving puzzles, especially when it involved having power over someone else. His taunts became more subtle, more psychological. One afternoon, as she was fluffing his pillows, he casually said, "That piano is looking dusty." A real shame to let such an expensive instrument just sit there. It's like having a beautiful bird and never letting it sing. Clara didn't respond. Just continued her work, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Another time. He had a classical music station playing softly on the radio. A gentle, flowing melody filled the room. "Do you listen to music, nurse?" he asked, his eyes closed as if he were just making idle conversation. "Or is your life as silent as your footsteps?" The question was a barb, designed to poke at the life he imagined she had won of poverty and drudgery. Devoid of beauty or art, she just murmured, "I don't have much time for music." "Sir?" and quickly left the room to fetch his water. He was enjoying this game. He was chipping away at her composure little by little. He could see the strain in her eyes, the way her hands would sometimes pause for a second, a flicker of a painful memory crossing her face before she masked it. He was a predator, and he could feel his prey weakening. He wanted more. He wanted to see that raw, unadulterated fear again. He wanted to break her completely. The breaking point came on a cloudy Wednesday afternoon. The city was shrouded in a gray mist, and the penthouse felt darker and more oppressive than ever. Clara was quietly reading a book in a chair across the room, trying to lose herself in the story and ignore the heavy silence. The man had been quiet for a long time, and she had allowed herself to relax. Just a little. Suddenly, the sharp, insistent ringing of his bell cut through the air. It was a sound that always made her heart jump, but this time it was more frantic, more demanding. She put her book down and hurried to his bedside. "Sir, is everything all right? Are you in pain?" He didn't answer. He was just staring at the piano, a strange, intense look on his face. Then, with a grunt of effort, he threw back the covers and swung his legs over the side of the bed. Clara's eyes widened in alarm. He hadn't gotten out of bed by himself in weeks. "Sir, please. You shouldn't be up. You could fall." He ignored her, his face set with a grim determination. He grabbed his cane, which was leaning against the nightstand, and slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. He was unsteady at first, his thin body trembling with the effort, but he managed to stand. He took a slow, shuffling step, then another, making his way towards the piano. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing. Should she help him? Should she stop him? She was torn between her duty as a nurse and her paralyzing fear of what he was about to do. He made his way to the piano and leaned heavily against it, his breathing ragged. He ran a hand over the dusty lid, his fingers tracing the elegant curves of the wood. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were blazing with a cold, hard fire. There was no trace of weakness or illness in his expression now. "Only cruelty. You will play it now," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Right now. Clara felt a wave of panic wash over her. "Sir, I can't. Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't make me." He let out a short, harsh laugh. It was an ugly sound, devoid of any humor. "You will. Or you will be out of this apartment and this job before sundown." He paused, letting the threat sink in. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "And that's not all. I will make a few phone calls. I have friends on the board of every major hospital in this city. I will tell them you were incompetent, that you were negligent, that you stole from me. I will ruin your reputation. You will never work as a nurse again. Do you understand me?" Never. The threat hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. It wasn't just about this job anymore. It was about her entire future, her ability to care for her mother, to send her brother to school. He was threatening to destroy everything. He was backing her into a corner with no way out. He saw the despair in her eyes, the utter hopelessness, and a triumphant smirk touched his lips. He had won. He had broken her, but he was wrong. Something inside her snapped. It was like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but suddenly something else rose up to meet it. A hot surge of anger. Anger at his cruelty, at his injustice, at the years of bitterness he had taken out on her. Anger at the memory of the cold, heartless way he had dismissed her after Eleanor died. He had taken her dreams once. He would not take her dignity. Her trembling stopped. Her hands, which had been wringing in front of her, fell to her sides, clenched into tight fists. She lifted her head and looked him directly in the eye. For the first time, she didn't look away. She met his cold, cruel gaze with a fire of her own. "You want to know why I won't play?" she said, her voice shaking but clear, strong in a way it had never been before. "You want to know why I'm so scared? That song isn't a piece of entertainment for you to enjoy. It's a tombstone. It's a memory of a life you took away from me." The words came pouring out of her, a torrent of long-suppressed pain and rage. The power dynamic in the room shifted in an instant. She was no longer the frightened servant. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the man, for the first time in a very long time, looked truly shocked. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. "That song isn't a piece of entertainment for you to enjoy. It's a tombstone." The silence that followed was more deafening than any of his shouts. It was a thick, suffocating silence filled with 20 years of unspoken grief. Alistair Finch, the man who held her life in his hands, just stared. His cruel smirk was gone, wiped clean from his face. For the first time she saw something other than malice in his pale blue eyes. It was confusion, a flicker of disbelief. As if she had started speaking a language he didn't understand, Clara's heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but the tremor in her hands had vanished. The fear was still there, a cold knot deep inside her, but it was no longer in control. She had spoken her truth, and now there was no going back. She stood tall, her shoulders back, meeting his gaze without flinching. She was no longer a scared nurse. She was the keeper of a memory, and she would not let him desecrate it. "What did you just say?" He finally managed to croak, his voice a mere shadow of its usual commanding tone. He leaned against the piano for support, but it wasn't the weakness of his illness that made him tremble. "It was the shock. You heard me," Clara said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "That song, Claire de Lune, I didn't just hear it on the radio. I played it. In this room, on that piano." She pointed a steady finger at the polished black wood. "I played it for your wife, Eleanor. Every day. For years." The name hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, his eyes widening. "Eleanor?" he whispered, the name feeling foreign and painful on his lips. "Yes, Eleanor," Clara continued, her voice softening slightly, filled with a warmth that had been absent for so long. "I was just a girl when I came to work here. A poor girl from the other side of the city with nothing but a dream of music. Your wife, she saw something in me. She was the kindest, most gentle person I have ever known. She didn't just give me a job. She gave me hope. She paid for my lessons, she encouraged me, she told me I had a gift. That piano wasn't just a piece of furniture to her, and it wasn't to me. It was our sanctuary. And Claire de Lune, that was our song. It was the last thing she ever heard me play." As she spoke, the hard lines on Alistair's face began to soften. The mask of the cruel, bitter old man was cracking, falling away piece by piece. He was no longer looking at a servant he could torment. He was looking into the past. His mind, which had been a fortress of anger and resentment for 2 decades, was suddenly flooded with images. He saw a young girl, her face bright with concentration, her fingers flying across the keys. He saw the sunlight catching the dust motes in the air, just as Clara had remembered. He heard the gentle, haunting melody filling the house, pushing back the silence and the sickness. He remembered now. He had forgotten. He had pushed all those memories away because they were too painful. They were a reminder of what he had lost, of the vibrant, loving woman his wife had been, and the empty shell he had become. He had treated the music as a nuisance, a constant reminder of his wife's fading health. He had resented the girl who brought that music, because she was a symbol of the life that was slipping away from him. His gaze shifted from Clara's face to her hands. They were no longer clenched into fists, but resting at her sides. They were not the smooth, nimble hands of the girl he remembered. They were the hands of a woman who had worked hard, who had struggled, who had faced hardship. They were a little swollen, the knuckles a bit red. They were hands that had cleaned and cooked and cared for the sick and held the hands of the dying. And in that moment he finally saw her. Truly saw her. He saw the tired lines around her eyes not as a sign of weakness, but as a map of a difficult life. A life that had taken a sharp, cruel turn the day his wife died. "You." He breathed, his voice barely audible. "The girl with the music book. You were her companion." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of dawning, horrifying realization. All the pieces were clicking into place. The strange familiarity he had felt when he first hired her, the unexplained sadness in her eyes that he had so enjoyed tormenting. It all made sense now. He hadn't just been demanding a song from a random nurse. He had been forcing the ghost of his wife's most cherished companion to relive her most painful memory. All for his own cruel amusement, a wave of shame. So intense and unfamiliar it made him feel sick, washed over him. He, a man who had prided himself on his power and his control, had never felt so small, so utterly wretched. He had spent years building a wall around his heart, pushing everyone away with his bitterness and anger. He thought it made him strong. But looking at the woman in front of him, A woman whose life he had irrevocably damaged. He realized he hadn't been building a fortress. He had been building a prison, and he was the only one inside it. The power in the room had completely evaporated. There was no master and servant, no tormentor and victim. There were only two people connected by a shared, painful history. The air was thick with the ghost of Eleanor, a presence that was more real now than it had been in 20 years. Alistair slowly, carefully lowered himself onto the piano bench. His movements were no longer sharp and demanding, but slow and heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of all his wasted years. He looked at the closed keyboard, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of all its cruelty, all its arrogance. It was just the quiet, fragile voice of an old, broken man. "Play it," he asked, his eyes fixed on the keys. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "Please. Not for me. Play it for her." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the medical machines and the ragged breathing of the old man. Clara looked at his slumped figure, a silhouette of defeat against the polished black wood of the piano. The anger that had fueled her courage began to fade, leaving behind a profound sadness. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. A tragedy for a young girl who lost her dreams, for a kind woman who lost her life, and for a bitter man who had lost his way. She saw not a cruel tyrant, but a lonely, broken soul trapped in a prison of his own making. His plea, "Play it for her," echoed in her mind. It wasn't a command anymore. It was a prayer. She took a slow, deep breath and walked towards the piano. Her footsteps were no longer hesitant, but calm and purposeful. She didn't look at him as she sat down on the bench beside him, keeping a respectful distance. The air between them was thick with unspoken history. She reached out a hand and lifted the keyboard lid. It was heavy, as if it were lifting the weight of 20 years of silence. Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys, white and smooth like old bones. They were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation, from the sheer weight of the moment. She was about to open a door she had sworn she would never open again. But this time it was different. She wasn't being forced. She was choosing to. For Eleanor. And for herself, her fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of Claire de Lune filled the room. The sound was hesitant at first, a little shaky, like a voice waking from a long sleep. It carried the ghost of her past pain, the memory of a young girl's shattered dreams. But as the melody began to unfold, her fingers found their strength. The years of hard work and struggle had not stolen the music from her soul. They had only buried it. Now it was rising to the surface, flowing through her hands and into the instrument. The music swelled, no longer hesitant, but clear and strong and achingly beautiful. It was the sound of moonlight on a still lake, of a peaceful memory, of a love that transcended time and death. It filled every corner of the sterile penthouse, chasing away the cold and the silence, transforming it from a gilded cage into a sanctuary once more. As she played. She closed her eyes, and she was no longer in the present. She was back in that sun-drenched room playing for Eleanor. She could almost feel the gentle, encouraging presence of the woman who had believed in her. She played for the young girl she used to be, pouring all the love and regret she had for that lost life into the music. It was a farewell, a tribute, and a release, all in one. Beside her, Alistair was perfectly still. At first he just listened, his head bowed. But as the melody washed over him, a dam inside him began to crack. The music was a key, unlocking memories he had kept padlocked for 2 decades. He saw Eleanor's face not as it was at the end, pale and frail, but as it was when she was full of life. He saw her smiling, her eyes alight with joy as she listened to the music. He remembered the way she would hum along, her head tilted to one side. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the sound of her laughter. He remembered the love he had for her, a love so deep and pure that it had shattered him when she was gone. He had spent 20 years trying to forget that pain, burying it under layers of anger and bitterness. But the music brought it all rushing back. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. Then another. Soon a steady stream of tears was flowing, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He made no sound, but his grief was a palpable force in the room. He wasn't crying for himself. He was crying for Eleanor. He was crying for the years he had wasted, for the love he had lost, for the kindness he had forgotten. He was crying for the girl whose life he had so carelessly damaged. All the cruelty, all the power, all the money, it all meant nothing in the face of this pure, overwhelming sorrow. He was just a man who had lost his wife, and he was finally allowing himself to grieve. When the last note faded into the silence, Clara let her hands rest on the keys. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just let the sacred silence settle over them. It was a clean, healing silence, full of release and understanding. She could hear Alistair's quiet sobs slowly subsiding, replaced by deep, weary breaths. After a long time he spoke, his voice thick with emotion and stripped of all its former hardness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words heavy with a lifetime of regret. He didn't look at her, just stared at his own hands resting on his lap. "I was so angry. After she was gone, the world felt so cold and empty. I didn't know how to live in it. So I decided to make everyone else feel as cold and empty as I did. It was easier than feeling the pain." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed and clear, the ice blue now softened by a profound sadness. "What I did to you, what I said, there's no excuse. I am so sorry." Clara looked at him, and in that moment she forgave him. Not for his sake, but for her own. Carrying the anger and resentment was too heavy a burden. "She was a wonderful woman," Clara said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. "She changed my life." A new understanding passed between them. They were no longer a wealthy man and a poor nurse. They were two people connected by a shared love for a remarkable woman. In the weeks that followed, the penthouse was transformed. The coldness was gone, replaced by a quiet, gentle peace. Alistair was a changed man. The sharp-tongued cruelty had vanished, replaced by a thoughtful, reflective quiet. He often asked Clara to play not just Claire de Lune, but other songs from the leather-bound book he had found tucked away in a closet. The music was no longer a source of pain, but a bridge between them, a way to remember Eleanor with love instead of sorrow. One afternoon, he called her into his study. He was sitting at his desk, looking healthier than he had in months. "Eleanor always wanted to start a foundation," he said, his voice steady. "A charity to help young artists who had the talent but not the means. She believed everyone deserved a chance to share their gift." He slid a piece of paper across the desk towards her. It was a proposal. "I have the money to make it happen, but I don't have the heart for it. Not anymore." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a genuine respect. "I would be honored if you would run it for us." In her memory. Clara looked at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. It was an offer beyond her wildest dreams. It was security, not just for her, but for her family. But more than that, it was a chance to honor the woman who had given her so much. It was a chance to give other young girls the hope that Eleanor had given her. She looked up at Alistair Finch, the man who had been her tormentor and was now her benefactor, and saw not a wealthy man, but a fellow traveler on the road to healing. The piano was no longer a tombstone, but a beginning. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara's future was filled with the beautiful, hopeful sound of music.